Good afternoon, folks, and thanks for joining us on the most anticipated Tuesday of the year. Welcome to the USA Today Network New Jersey's live coverage of the 2020 election. I'm Jessie Gomez.
And I'm Ryan Ross. Over the course of the next hour, our reporters and political experts will break down the issues and topics that matter most to you. We're talking the presidential election, state congressional races, and legal weed, among other topics.
That's right, Ryan. And this year, New Jersey sets itself apart by holding the third vote-by-mail election since the pandemic hit the state in March. Now, from COVID-19 to ongoing calls for racial justice, it's been a tumultuous year for Americans.
And with so many of us voting by mail, there may not be a clear winner tonight, but we'll examine how we got to this point in American history and how the immediate future will impact life moving forward.
That's right, and we've got a lot of ground to cover in the next hour, so let's get into it.
Remember last January and February, before the coronavirus known as COVID-19 swept through America? Joe Biden was still scratching his way to the Democratic presidential nomination. President Donald Trump had been impeached by the House of Representatives and was about to go on trial before the U.S. Senate, where he was acquitted in early February. Today's election seemed far off. New Jersey, indeed all of America, had no idea how much the COVID-19 pandemic would impact just about every corner of life, especially the presidential election. But it wasn't just politics that was affected. Across the state, hospitals were overrun with sick patients. Thousands died. Nurses and doctors took on double shifts. Grocery shelves were swept bare of food and such basics as toilet paper. Offices shut down, along with all manner of small businesses, from hair salons to restaurants. And schools? Children and parents, and teachers too, had to adjust to home learning over computers. Broadway went dark. So did movie theaters. Zoom calls became the new way of conversing. Facial masks became part of our wardrobes. Who knew that former Governor Chris Christie would be hospitalized after being infected with the virus, and that Governor Phil Murphy would have to go into quarantine after several members of his staff got sick? Indeed, who knew that President Trump would eventually become infected and spend time in the hospital? Our world had suddenly been turned upside down, inside out, and our basic American right to cast a vote for elected officials to represent us, well, that changed too. Now here on Election Day, we see what COVID-19 has done. More than 235,000 New Jerseyans have been infected by the virus. Some 15,000 across the state have died. And after a summer's lull, the virus is spiking again with more death. Doctors warn of a long, hard winter ahead. Here in New Jersey, to prevent the spread of COVID, most voters will cast their ballots through the mail. Indeed, huge chunks of New Jersey's voters have already mailed in their ballots, and small armies of election staff are already counting them. Even before Election Day, however, the Garden State had to change its voting plans in other ways because of COVID. For starters, we changed the date of the state primary from June to July. Before that, as our state conducted local elections in May, we saw firsthand some of the problems that our creaky, outdated election system might have to confront with mailed-in ballots. In Paterson, for example, state authorities ended up arresting and charging 4 people, 2 of them city council candidates, with ballot fraud. Was this small case in Paterson a sign of problems to come? So far, New Jersey does not seem to be awash in problems from the mailed-in balloting. But time will tell. Yes, we've arrived at Election Day with the COVID-19 pandemic atop the nation's list of issues. And one day this virus will disappear. But our world will never be the same. For the USA Today Network, I'm Mike Kelly.
All righty, folks, so let's welcome in our first guest to chat about the suburban blue wave that is sweeping the Garden State. So with us today is our New Jersey-based historian, Joshua Zeitz, and our very own NerdTeach.com columnist and political expert, Mike Kelly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hey, Jesse, thanks for having me.
Nice to be with you.
Awesome. Great to have you folks. So we have a lot to cover in the next 15 minutes here, but we really want to talk about what's happening here with this blue suburban wave that's hitting these communities. Now, former Vice President Joe Biden is heavily favored to win New Jersey this year, according to the latest polls. So urban areas skewed heavily Democratic in 2016. And what we're also seeing is that Republicans are pulling away for their support for President Trump. Now, what does this mean for the election? And what does this mean for today? You want to start off, Mike?
Sure, Jesse. I think in New Jersey, I think Joe Biden will probably win here quite handily. But what I'm looking at is the suburbs, because I really think New Jersey is a barometer of the nation on some level with suburban voting. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at a district here in northern New Jersey, the 5th Congressional District that Josh Gottheimer represents. And what I want to see here in particular is what is the margin of victory if Gottheimer wins. And he's largely favored to win. And just to give you an idea about how much that district has changed in favor of the Democrats, there used to be, in 2012 in that district, there were only 119,000 registered Democrats. Today, there are 183,000 registered Democrats. The Republicans have not been able to match that. And we're seeing that all over these key suburban districts around Morristown and in Somerset, in Union counties. It's the same story. So I think if we look at this as New Jersey as a barometer of the nation, I think we got to look at the suburbs and how they are changing very much in the Democrats' column.
Absolutely. Now, Josh, you are a historian here. So what can we learn from history when it comes to these areas that primarily were Democratic, but now today we might see that they skew a little bit more on our Democratic side?
I think that political demography and political geography changes and realigns itself every couple of decades throughout American history. It doesn't do it magically. There's usually some set of structural or kind of human-led events that lead you there. I mean, if you look at the history of New Jersey, between say 1968 and 1988, it was a solid red state. It was one of the first states, I'd say, in the North to have actually kind of adopted Richard Nixon's silent majority appeal. It had been a good, strong supporter of the New Deal. It had a heavily urban and white ethnic industrial base. These were precisely the same voters who, in inner ring suburbs, by 1968 began to leave the Democratic Party over fears around crime, fears around taxes, fears around the sort of counterculture that they increasingly associated with the Democratic Party. It was also a time in the 1970s when you had a rapid industrialization that particularly hit former Democrats, blue-collar Democrats, hard. It was Bill Clinton who first figured out in 1992 how to build a coalition of minorities, largely from New Jersey's urban areas, and more affluent suburban voters who were ready to come back to the Democratic Party after it tacked to the center. What you see today is a very new realignment. I think that what you're experiencing all over the country, particularly in the Sun Belt and in places like northern Bergen County, a defection en masse of suburban voters who tend to be more diverse than suburban voters of 1968, both demographically and ethnically. And they're defecting en masse. I think Trump was the catalyst for, he was a catalyst of this, but he was not the root cause of it. It was already happening, 10 years ago.
Right.
Right. Now, we also want to welcome in our media commentator and civil rights expert, Walter Fields. Now, Walter, we're talking about this suburban blue wave that's hitting these typically areas that were dominated by the GOP, but today we're seeing a shift, a new skew because of what's happening in terms of Trump's leadership and COVID-19 and racial reckoning in our country. Walter, what's your insight on this new blue wave that we're seeing in these areas?
Well, I think it reflects a demographic shift that we saw starting with the last census. The last census was the first census taken when the majority of African Americans now live in suburban communities, no longer central cities. And I think the demographic shift has outpaced the political transformation of one party in particular, the Republican Party, which is sort of relying on old metrics in terms of its appeal to voters in New Jersey. And as you see the suburbanization occur in New Jersey, I think more and more you're going to find this to be a state that Republicans want to in. The 5 of the state's counties are now majority minority, which suggests, and they're the most populous counties, which suggests that any political party that wants to do well in New Jersey, they have to appeal to this diverse electorate, and they can no longer appeal to a very narrow band of voters. So I think what we're seeing in New Jersey today, and I think what we're going to see across the country, is the reality that suburbs have changed. They are no longer these bastion of white middle-class voters. They are much more diverse. They're a little younger than they used to be, and they have voters who have a wide range of concerns that are out of sync with what the Trump administration has been doing over the last 4 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, folks, I want to point, before we get into your comment, Mike, I want to point you folks to some data. According to the data, non-college educated white voters who gave Trump just enough margin to win in 2016, they're declining. Now, while both minority voters, like you were saying, Walter, and white college educated voters are on the rise. So as we're talking about kind of this wave that we're seeing, is that declining? Are those trends an effect of today, what we might see as results and possible support or non-support for President Trump? Mike, do you have some comments?
Well, sure. Jesse, I really think, and I agree with what Walter said there, that the suburbs are much more diverse. And we saw that this summer in many of the Black Lives Matter marches that took place in many suburban communities. I went to a march in Ridgewood, for example. Ridgewood, a place that a couple of generations ago had clauses in real estate documents where they wouldn't allow non-Christians or non-whites to buy houses there. There was a very large march in that town led by both Black folks and white folks. And so I think we were seeing similar gatherings across, particularly Bergen County and other suburban areas. But what I also think is going on here, and I think there is a transformation of what it really means to be a suburbanite. And I think many people who are now moving to the suburbs are embracing a much more progressive lifestyle. It's easy to compare what is happening today with 1968. And believe it or not, I actually remember 1968. And there's a very different, it's very similar in the sense that the nation is very divided. But when we look at the suburbs, we are looking at many more progressives out here. And I think what we are seeing here in New Jersey is really going to multiply across the nation tonight in the election and in the years to come.
All of this raises a really interesting kind of question that political historians have asked, over generations, which is that, can a fundamental shift in demography change the very nature, can the change in demography and the electorate, create realignments, or do parties let those things happen? An example of this is in the 1920s, when an entire generation of new Americans came of age and were able to vote. These were the children of Italian and Jewish and Polish and Russian and Irish immigrants. And because the Republican Party, essentially thumbed its nose at them when they were able to vote by the 1920s and late 20s and early 30s. And the 1928, 1930 congressional elections were the first harbinger of it, or the 30 elections. They created a generational realignment toward the Democrats. And the question is today, is our changing demography, not just in the suburbs, but really the changing American demography, does that augur some sort of natural shift? And what's fascinating is that it doesn't have to for the Republicans. There are soft spots within the non-white voting population for Democrats, particularly among Latino men, particularly among Latino men without college educations. There are non-white populations that tend to be much more religiously conservative and probably would be receptive to the Republican message, but the party has radicalized itself in such a way that it is in danger of losing the demographic, its grasp on demographic possibility for a generation in the same way that the Republicans in 1920.
I would agree with you on that. And I think what I'm hearing, and I spent quite a bit of time on the ground, not only here in New Jersey, but also in Pennsylvania. And what I'm hearing from so many people out there what the turning point was Donald Trump, and and that works two ways. If you are a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, you have embraced Donald Trump and all of his entire agenda. If you are on the fence, however, or a Democrat, and this is where I think the interesting shift is going, you have rejected Donald Trump. So I think it's comparable to some respects to what happened in the 1920s, and in particular in 1932 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt swept into office with a whole new generation of people who were just thinking very differently about government. Is that going to happen this year? I think it's too early to tell yet, but I do see some of those shifts, those demographic and generational shifts, taking place right here in the suburbs.
Absolutely. Walter, do you have some insight you'd like to share? Alrighty. Let's move on to our next question here. We've kind of touched upon this blue wave and what's really fueling it, but let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Now, this year has really been a test of Trump's leadership as commander-in-chief. We've seen a lot of criticism on his response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this, and a question for you, Mike and Josh, is this something that will skew results, or even those folks who are traditionally GOP voters, will that kind of prompt them to cross over party lines?
I think so. It's happening on some levels here. But here's the danger, I think, for Democrats. And this is why I think this may not be a generational shift yet. I don't know. And we have to sort of, I think this is where the Democratic Party needs to really be careful about what's happening here. Donald Trump is the issue in this election for many, many, many voters. If Donald Trump is defeated tonight, how is that going to shift how the Democrats approach future elections and how the Republicans approach future elections? And quite frankly, I don't think I can call that one yet. I don't know about you, Josh. What do you see?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, when I look at the last two Democratic presidential races, this one and Hillary Clinton's, right, they kind of resemble something I worked on when I was writing about Lyndon Johnson. It's really what they called a front lash strategy. Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee in '64, was so polarizing that really he was the issue. And Democrats, there were Democratic strategists who called this a front lash campaign that Johnson ran, where he really made Goldwater the issue. And of course, LBJ won a resounding, overwhelming victory, but it proved somewhat pyrrhic because by 1968, the Republicans were able to come racing back. And so, to defeat Donald Trump on the basis of his overwhelming unpopularity, he is without a doubt, he has failed on a scale that we've never seen in American history when it came to the pandemic. That's one thing, but then how do Democrats put together a longer standing coalition in a country that's changing rapidly from a demographic standpoint, from a political geography standpoint? And Democrats are going to have their own divisions to deal with in a potential Biden administration between, a younger and resurgent left and those who are more in the center.
Absolutely. Now, folks, we're wrapping up our segment. Any last thoughts before we head on to our next conversation? Mike?
Well, I agree with Josh on this one. The period between 1964 and 1968 is very, very instructive. A lot was done in a very progressive way with what Lyndon Johnson was able to get through. I mean, if you think of the level of legislation that was passed then, not only dealing with civil rights, but other major progressive programs that are still with us today and are frankly being challenged by many conservatives. The question now is if Democrats prevail tonight, and I think they will, at least in New Jersey on a congressional level, and certainly in voting and supporting for Joe Biden, if that trend continues across the nation, what will happen to the Democratic Party? And that, I think, is a major question about where the party's going and how fast it will get there, if it is going in any particular direction.
Yeah, I guess I completely agree with Mike, and I think my last observation would be that it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in New Jersey. There are states like New Jersey and Rhode Island, which have effectively become, one-party states at the state and local level, where you have a rising progressive wing of the Democratic Party that's not only going to demand a lot of Biden and a potential Democratic Congress, but they might look at their state Democratic Party leadership, which in many places and in many ways tends to be much more conservative than where maybe the primary electorate is moving. And I'd be fascinated to see not only if that division within the Democratic Party plays out in Washington, but if it begins to play out in Trenton.
And in next year's governor's race.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we have a lot to look forward to this evening. Josh, Mike, thank you so much for joining us and appreciate
Thank
you
you.
being here.
Great to be with you.
It's a pleasure.
All right, folks, let's keep moving. We're going to talk congressional races next. Ryan Ross is here to give you all the insight.
Our live Election Day show continues now with a look at the most talked about congressional races happening around the Garden State. We're supposed to look at the candidates and biggest stories surrounding each campaign. We welcome in our next panel of experts to the show. From the USA Today Network, we have political reporters Ashley Balderzak, Charlie Stile, and Terrence McDonald, as well as the director of the Fairleigh Dickinson University poll, Krista Jenkins. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. And Ashley, we'll begin with you. We mentioned congressional races at the top, but yes, there is a Senate race as well on the ballot in New Jersey. Whether or not it got lost in the shuffle with these congressional races and the presidential election, who knows about that? But let's talk about Cory Booker and his race and how it's been going.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, Cory Booker is running for re-election. He is facing a political newcomer named Rick Maida. He is a pharmacist, a lawyer, founded some pharmaceutical companies. So it honestly hasn't seemed like much of a race. You haven't really seen many ads. Cory Booker has been campaigning for other people, helping raise money. There was one political debate hosted by the New Jersey Globe. And the polls are showing that Booker has quite a substantial lead there, like more than 20 points. So we'll see what happens. But that's, yeah.
Let's get into some of these congressional races. And Terrence, we'll start with you, but of course, anyone can jump in this discussion. It was mentioned a little bit at the top of the show, but Josh Gottheimer in the 5th Congressional District seeking a 3rd term after spending 4 years representing a district that was evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, but is tilting more Democrat. And the strategy that Gottheimer has to have, this tightrope he has to walk, appealing to liberals while not alienating conservatives.
Yes, he sort of branded himself as a problem solver and a moderate voice in a party that has started to look at leaders like AOC. And he's running against Republican Frank Pallotta. The pollsters believe that Gottheimer has the edge here. They believe that this is a likely Democratic seat, but neither of them are really taking it for granted. And yeah.
And in terms of the polls too, Krista, what are you seeing from your end?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of the polls that we do have access to are really conducted more at the statewide level. It's pretty rare to find any specific district level data. So I really, I can't speak to that. I would simply say that given the trend, that's obviously going on in the state with preponderance of people supporting Joe Biden, Cory Booker, I think it's going to be a difficult night for those who are down ballot, who are not, don't have a D after their name.
Another congressional race we're watching comes out of the 9th district. This one gathering some attention because the opponent challenging the incumbent in this race with some ties to QAnon. What do we know about this race and really the news surrounding this?
Yes, this is the 9th district that Bill Pascrell has represented for over 20 years. And his opponent this year, Republican Billy Prempeh, has been sort of flirting with the QAnon conspiracy theory. He told me that he didn't know much about it, but he does have a photo up on his Facebook page of him at a Trump rally where he's posed next to a guy holding a big Q flag. He also used a hashtag on Twitter that people in the QAnon movement use. He says that that's sort of just a distraction to keep the voters from focusing on the issues in the race. But it's not really compelling when you start to hear him talk about this conspiracy theory. It sort of sounds like he's really bought in on it.
And another race we're watching as well, too, down in South Jersey, the 2nd Congressional District involving Jeff Van Drew. People might remember that name. He was once a Democrat, has since changed parties as a Republican. Charlie, what are you hearing from that race, and what are his chances in South Jersey?
Well, what I'm hearing are a lot of Democrats are nervous. They think it's a coin toss, that Van Drew has made this closer than the polls have suggested. And it is a very conservative, rural, blue-collar district, center right, I would say. And that some of the mechanics of the race have not broken to Democrat Amy Kennedy's advantage. One advantage was her last name, and that apparently doesn't have the star power down there that people thought it would. And there have been some complaints about her getting her ground game started a little too late, and that one big controversial operative in Atlantic City is on the payroll of Republican Van Drew. So it's going to be close. Part of me believes that if this is a blue wave, though, I think that will carry Kennedy to the finish line. But this is a race that's been nationally watched because of Van Drew's high-profile defection last December. It became a national star, which is really unusual for that district because normally the congressmen from that or congresspeople from that district tend to be below the radar, district first, worry about the Coast Guard and casinos. They don't really get on national TV.
And in terms of this election too, Krista, for the polls, 2016 compared to 2018, now compared to 2020, what are some differences and similarities we might be seeing this time around?
Well, there's been so much made, I think, about sort of the misfire of 2016 and how pollsters really led Americans astray. I mean, there's ample evidence out there. At the national level, the polls were actually quite accurate. Statewide polls missed the mark, particularly in the battleground states. Whatever errors existed at the time, I think, have certainly been corrected. So to the extent that we're looking at polling in 2016 versus 2020, I believe it's considerably different. I mean, obviously, there's just so many other ways 2020 is different. We've got the pandemic, we have an economic collapse, we have so many other things. So it's sort of like comparing apples to oranges.
And it's very different, as you said. And Ashley, this is something you've been following as well. With so many of us voting by mail, really just unlike any election that any of us have seen in our lifetimes, at least. What have you been learning about this, and how is this compared to years past?
Yeah, so we've had a ton of people submit their ballots by mail. I think the last count that I saw was about 3.7 million, and that's about 61% of the voters. And in 2016, there were 68%. So we're getting really close. And this is not counting all of the people that are casting provisional ballots today. People can still put a ballot in the mail, though election officials urge you not to. Use a drop box or deliver your ballot to your Board of Elections. But yeah, I'm very interested to see the total turnout numbers because it seems like we're getting there pretty quickly.
And another congressional race too, I want to touch on another one out of South Jersey with Andy Kim, Terrence or Charlie, whoever wants to jump in on this. Andy Kim won pretty narrowly 2 years ago, right, on the ballot again for this election. What are we seeing out of that race?
Right now, that tilts towards Kim. He's running against David Richter, businessman from Mount Laurel, came from a prominent business family there. But Richter seems strangely ambivalent about running. He hasn't really put the resources behind the race that everybody thought he would be. The National Republican Campaign Committee has withdrawn some of its investment in that race. Still, I think some Democrats are nervous because this is a district that's roughly evenly divided between Ocean County and Burlington County, with Ocean County sort of a hotbed for Trumpism. And Burlington is predominantly Democrat, although you do have some pockets, some enclaves of Trumpism. So there's the fear I've heard from some Democrats is that the numbers in Ocean County, the fervent pro-Trump vote there could be larger than expected. And maybe Kim and the Democrats are not as amped up and as enthused as they were 2 years ago in the blue wave of 2018. I still think it's Kim's.
And you mentioned too some of the finance angles, Ashley. That's something too you've been following. What are some of the campaign finance filings, and how big has the spending been for this election?
Yeah, so out of all of the congressional races, that District 2 has kind of drawn the most in. It's in like the top 20 of races across the country where mostly the Democratic and the Republican Party groups have been pouring money in, but you also see like Charlie wrote about how Michael Bloomberg had poured money into a new super PAC that was spending there. So Kennedy kind of has the edge there, but they both, it's like 7 million to 6 million. There's a ton of money there. District 7 also had quite a bit of money. Kane had the slight upper hand with the outside funds, but Malinowski has raised much more, spent about double as Malinowski there. And then with District 3, Ken just also kind of blows Richter out of the water and $3.5 million of outside help, while Richter got $600,000. So the Democrats here have really been benefiting from outside money in their own fundraising.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that 7th district race you alluded to. Tom Kane Jr., the son of the popular former governor, is running, trying to dislodge first-term incumbent Tom Malinowski. And he's doing it in really one of the ugliest, mudslinging ad campaigns we've seen. So maybe in the top 25, if you want to rank him in the past decade in New Jersey, but trying to suggest that Malinowski is a lobbyist for Human Rights Watch about 15 years ago was lobbying to protect sex offenders. It's a ridiculous charge, and it sort of tarnishes the Kane brand. So I'm not sure how that really is going to play out in this race. It's a strange play, but I could understand some of the mechanics they wanted to make Malinowski unpalatable, but I don't know. It seems to be disconnected to the tenor of the time.
About 2 minutes left in this segment, so I just want to quickly go around the panel, and Krista, will begin with you. As we sit here about 4:30 or so in the afternoon on Election Day, I'm just curious, some of the storylines, some of the numbers that you're tracking that will have your attention for the rest of the night and the days after the election.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting angles to follow. I think turnout is going to be a huge story because, not just in New Jersey, but nationwide, what does this do to the likelihood of people actually voting? We've always struggled in this country with so many people who don't take part. If in fact we've made it that much easier for people to vote that they do, I think that could, have lasting implications for how we, conduct elections in this country. And then I think, might seem a little odd. I haven't heard much talk about it today, but I think the other really interesting story that's not getting a lot of coverage is state legislative elections. We don't have any, of course, in New Jersey. Ours are next year. But there's a whole bunch of states across the country that are having state legislative elections. And the outcome of those will really determine the way in which redistricting is done, based on census data. And, that can have lasting implications well into the next decade. So those are some things I'm interested in watching.
How about for the rest of our panel? Charlie, what are some things that really have your attention tonight?
Well, I think that was really interesting. I'm really concerned about the post election day debate over vote counting, and I worry that is we're in for an ugly ride over the next week. I hope not. Maybe because in Jersey we're not so prominent, but nationally that's going to be a real problem.
I'm actually really.
Oh, Ashley, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm interested. There actually are 2 legislative races, special elections that are happening this year. And I live in Morris County, so I'm interested with LD 25. You have Anthony Bucco, who was appointed to his deceased father's Senate seat, and he is running against Rupande Mehta. And then the assembly seat is Ora Dunn, the incumbent, who won that seat to fill Anthony Bucco's against Darcy Drager. So this has mostly been a Republican district, but it looks like, as what Mike Kelly was talking about and the former panel, that they may have a chance, the Democrats, to seize that. So I'm interested in that.
Last but not least, Terrence, we'll wrap up with you.
I'm curious about the mechanics of this specific election and whether New Jersey is going to make any substantial changes to the vote by mail rules that it sort of made up on the fly when it had to, when it chose to make this election largely a by mail contest. Like, for example, in July, they tossed something like 40,000 ballots were rejected and not counted, which was just a massive increase from 4 years before. And I'm sort of curious how that's going to play out now and whether they're going to look at what's happening to the ballots in this election and decide to make any changes to make it easier for next time if we're doing this again.
Great information. I'd really like to thank all of you for stopping by the show and sharing your knowledge and insight into these congressional races. And of course, for results and analysis of these congressional contests, stay with the USA Today Network, New Jersey. Thank you to Ashley, Charlie, Terrence, and Krista. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Take care.
Now, as we prepare to welcome in our next group of panelists to discuss the impact of this summer's demonstrations on the election, we will first take a look at what it takes for a protest to bring about real change.
Not all protests are created equal. Some lead to change while others maintain the status quo or even lead to anarchy. The reason for success isn't random, and this tiny percentage has a lot to do with it. First, we're defining success as a movement that fully achieved its goals within 2 years at the end of a campaign, and the campaign had a direct effect on the outcome. A Columbia University Press study says there are 2 things that tend to make a protest successful: nonviolence and an engagement rate of at least 3.5% of the population. That amount of engagement in the USA would be the equivalent of getting the populations of New York City and Los Angeles to all rally around one movement. The study looked at 323 campaigns for change from 1900 to 2006, particularly international cases that involved regime change or succession. Nonviolent campaigns were more than twice as effective in achieving their goals compared with campaigns that used violence. The reasons? Nonviolent movements have few barriers to entry, enabling them to mobilize more people and spread their message openly. In violent campaigns, fewer people tend to get involved, and their communication may be forced underground, reaching fewer people. Mobilizing at least 3.5% of the population is important too. The study showed all movements succeeded when at least that many people organized. The People Power Revolution met both of these thresholds. Millions of Filipinos took to the streets in peaceful protest and prayer. Ferdinand Marcos, who led the country since 1965, was toppled within a few days of the demonstrations. The 1977 to 1979 movement in Iran that toppled the Shah's dictatorship was another successful example. It brought the Shah's regime to an end, though another regime that was even more repressive ended up in power. Other studies have shown that movements that have clear, tangible goals tend to be more successful. Occupy Wall Street didn't have one clear goal, and for that reason, in many eyes, it failed. Movements that use different methods tend to fare better, as do ones that use provocative images and media to galvanize more people into the movement.
All right, folks. So the Black Lives Matter movement and police reform became major talking points for the 2020 election after nationwide protests following the deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Daniel Prude, and more Black Americans. With us to talk about this is once again media commentator and civil rights expert Walter Fields, executive director for the American Civil Liberties Union New Jersey, Amal Sinha, and Black Lives Matter Patterson organizer and activist Zeli Imani. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All righty, guys. So let's get into this discussion. Let's first talk about the Black Lives Matter impact on the elections this year. Now, as we know, Black Lives Matter was founded on a grassroots principle. There's no central leadership here. How heavily will the movement weigh on this year's election? You want to start off, Walter?
Well, I think it's going to weigh very heavily. I think what we see here is the first modern movement in American history. We have such wide diversity of participation. If you looked at some of the activities over the last 6 months, you saw a cross-section of America participating in these protest movements. And I think we've seen this enthusiasm in voting that I directly contribute to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it galvanized a section of America on the importance of electoral participation. And I think the outpouring we've seen in early voting is an indication that that energy has now transferred over into electoral participation.
Absolutely. Like you said, Walter, there is energy here. We're seeing that with the polls today, and we've seen them with our mail-in voting in the last couple of weeks. Amal, do you have some insight on the movement and its impact on elections this year?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. I do agree with Walter that I think that there is a sustained momentum right now that we hadn't seen in previous moments in American history. I think this sustained momentum is really growing, and that's important. But I think what we are realizing collectively as a society right now is that our voting rights and our elections don't occur in a vacuum. They occur in the context of the times. And just last week, we saw Walter Wallace Jr. Killed by Philadelphia police in front of his own mother. And so these are real, life consequences that are happening in real time. And I think people are responding. But I will say this, over the past several weeks that we've been seeing numbers of folks voting, we've been seeing amazing turnout in New Jersey. Over the past several weeks, the vast majority of the electorate has been white in New Jersey. 80% of those who have voted by mail vote so far have been white. And that is, that's disappointing, to say the least, in terms of the numbers and the diversity of New Jersey itself. So, and I'll say that it's not simply because people of color aren't voting, it's because there are systems that are designed to keep down the votes of people of color. And I know that my fellow panelists here have a lot to say about all of that.
Absolutely. Now, Zelly, you are on the ground. What are we hearing in terms of voter turnout and Black Lives Matter movement?
Yes, so as someone as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Say it one more time, sister.
Go ahead, you're good.
Oh, I was saying, someone that's on the ground on the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that we have been doing for the past 2 months has been organizing on the ground. We have been going out, educating people and organizing people to fill out the census, right? And also to realize that there's going to be mail-in ballots and to be on the lookout for those mail-in ballots. And when they do get it, it's as possible. One of the things that we quickly realized, right, in the Black Lives Matter movement, people, we also have to focus on organizing people. And with Black Lives Matter, one of the things we always say is that we're just not fighting for the lives that have been lost or taken from us by state violence, but we also must be focused on saving the lives that's still here on this earth. And that means that we have to be organizing and trying to get the resources for people that they deserve. And sometimes that fight means using all the tools in our disposal, which includes voting. So encouraging people that if you do think the problem is potholes or taking out the trash or the education system, or whatever the case may be, using the power of the vote, using the power of the census is just one tool of many tools that we have in our toolbox to gain the resources that our neighborhoods desperately need.
Absolutely. Now, gentlemen, all three of you are laying out issues, critical issues that voters are looking for change and relief from. Now, let's talk about President Trump's comments. So he's branded Black Lives Matter protesters, and I quote, as rioters, terrorists, Marxists, and left-wing radicals bent on destroying the country and defunding the police. Now, how does that translate to voters looking for change?
Well, I think, it's the same language that was used against the civil rights movement in the 1960s. People forget that Dr. King was labeled a communist. He was, labeled anti-patriotic. He was labeled as sort of an enemy of the state. So it's not surprising when there is a call for significant change that really addresses systemic issues of inequality in this country, that you would have sort of a perverse reaction, particularly from this president. So that doesn't surprise me. I think the issues at hand are issues that we have struggled with for decades, whether it's police brutality, whether it's educational access. I mean, these are issues that just haven't gone away. And I think in this moment, when we've seen these atrocities of police violence, it sort of crystallized our attention in a way that it hasn't in the past. And I believe some of what we're seeing, we mentioned Black voter turnout. I think one of the things that may be affecting New Jersey is this fear among many Black voters about voting early or mailing in their ballots, that they will not be counted. So I think today you will probably have a much larger turnout of Black voters than you did in early voting or mail-in balloting, because there was so much suspicion cast about an early voting process and cast from the White House, where you had a president who was doing everything possible to undermine the postal system. So I think many Black voters, knowing the history of being disfranchised, are probably showing up today in person at those polls to vote.
Absolutely. Do you have some insight on all for us in terms of our voters and what they want for change?
Sure. Well, let me talk for a minute about the president. This president not only benefits from the status quo, I think he benefits from regressive politics, right? Where it's his intention to bring things backwards or bring things to a screeching halt, not allow for progress, particularly not for people of color or and in particular the Black community. I think we've seen repeatedly from this president demonizing rhetoric for every minority group imaginable, and so it's not surprising that when it comes to the election, he's interested in either making sure that that people that are generally oppositional to him don't vote, or figuring out a way to question the integrity of the system in general. And I think that's what we're seeing from him, that he's trying to stoke fear and saying that the postal service isn't functioning, or these vote by mail ballots are not legitimate. I think that is a real problem, and when we hear it from the top, it's especially concerning, and that's why I think state leadership is so important right now. However, even at the state level, across our state, we're seeing injustices arise. Right, like we're seeing, for instance, Newark has only 2 secure mail ballot drop-off boxes. Right, the biggest city in our state, the city with the biggest population of people of color, I think it's over 90% people of color, only has 2 drop-off boxes. So what's that about? That's something that we could have fixed locally and had more opportunity for people to vote if we wanted that to be the case.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, you touched upon the issue on ballot boxes as well. Now, we're seeing also in Morris County and Dover, a town that's just 18,000 residents, primarily Hispanic and Latino, also just recently, 2 weeks before the election, got its own ballot box. And so in terms of voters coming out to vote, especially voters of color showing out for this election, what's gonna make them go out and vote today if they haven't voted already?
I think it's going to be the motivation of what's at stake. I think for the first time in this country, there's a clear awareness that our democracy is under attack. And so I think many people will be motivated not by a singular issue, but by the notion that this is an election that matters concerning whether or not we are going to continue this democratic experiment in America, or whether we're going to take a dark turn towards fascism. So I think many people get it. I think many people are motivated. I think, at the end of the day, I think what's going to drive this election is the rhetoric of this president, and whether or not the rhetoric induces people of goodwill to come out and vote, or whether it encourages the worst elements of this country and will subject us to another 4 years of this madness.
Absolutely. Zelly, once again, you are on the ground. What are the voters in your area saying in terms of change and the rhetoric coming from the White House?
It's a very scary time that we're living in right now, right? I believe like last year, there was over 994 racial or bias incidents that occurred in the state of New Jersey, like a 75% increase than the year previously. And this is all under the Trump administration. And many of us have been seeing videos lately, going viral of people of color being harassed and targeted by Trump supporters and white supremacists. We've seen like Proud Boys in New Jersey, in our small towns in New Jersey, and it's here, right? This white supremacy is here. So I think that a lot of people realize that this fight is much bigger than who is going to be in office as political presidency. That this fight that people need to take a stand right now against white supremacy, and the vote is the most powerful way that they can make a stand against white supremacy from arising and taking power here in New Jersey. We don't want it to continue to gain momentum, and we don't want it to harm any more individuals than it already has done so far.
Absolutely. Now, gentlemen, let's switch some gears. We're talking about change, we're talking about rhetoric, but we're also talking about the protests that we saw in the spring and the summer. And from those protests, what really emerged is the call to defund the police or end the police brutality. Now, how important is the Black Lives Matter movement, and not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the movement to defund the police here among voters in New Jersey? And has that gained steam with leaders here in the state?
Well, I think that people are listening differently today. And so I think some of the early concern about the language of defund the police has been minimized because people are maturing in their understanding of what that really means. And all that really means is looking at public safety differently. it means that we have to redefine roles in our state and in our communities of what the police do and how the police engage citizenry, and whether or not there are other means to address issues in our community that we now use police for. It's nothing but reordering budgetary priorities and reordering public policy to make sure that citizens are safe, and in return, make sure that police are safe. So I think the defund the police movement, as controversial it was when it first kicked off, I think people now are beginning to settle into the policy discussions around that language, which is critical if we're ever going to change, our society.
Absolutely. Amal, do you have some comments? I know you were on a live with us earlier this year talking specifically about this defund the police movement.
Yeah, you asked whether leaders, or whether it's resonating with the leaders in the state. I consider myself a leader in the state. I consider Zelly a leader and Walter a leader, and these are folks that it resonates with. It's the leaders that are elected officials that chose to sort of misinterpret what defund the police meant. I think Zelly and Walter and I were probably all on the same page about reallocating of resources, making sure that we were thinking about who the first responders are to instances where we don't need an armed police officer. There was an incident on the Parkway where somebody was killed. Maurice Thornton was killed by state police. What he really needed was a tow truck, right? He didn't need an armed police officer coming after him and escalating the situation more than it needed to be escalated. So if we insert that nuance into the conversation and elect leaders that understand nuance and want to engage in that conversation, then we're going to be in a better position to have the conversation. I think what we are seeing right now is resistance and the deliberate, oftentimes, misinterpretation of what it is that activists and advocates are calling for, which is a real problem. Because from what I understand about police budgets, and I've been looking into a lot of them, police budgets routinely get increased every single year without question. And in fact, having talked to several people in city councils across the state, I've learned that if anybody wants to start a program anywhere or invest anywhere, they'll cut any other budget other than the public safety budget or the police budget. And that's not, I don't care what ideological background you come from, it doesn't make any sense to blindly give money to a program without scrutinizing how that money is being used. So I think it's the call to defund the police is a call to reimagine policing and our first responses, but it's also a call of fiscal responsibility. It's a call of analyzing budgets and scrutinizing every dollar spent, which I think we as civilians should expect from our leaders at every level.
Absolutely. Zelly or Walter, anything else you want to chime in with specifically on this movement?
Well, yes, definitely. I agree with what the gentleman has said earlier about defunding the police. And I believe that since the beginning, since we started saying defunding the police, it has gained more momentum and more people have been able to understand it more clearly, especially folks that's in the public and in the communities. Once you're able to explain to people like what the city budgets are and how much money is allocated to the police versus how much money is allocated to recreation, people really tend to lean towards defunding the police. Like when you tell people that a quarter or more of the city's budget is allocated to the police, which is maybe $46 million, and only $2 million is for the recreation for the youth, then people are saying, hey, like, why can't we take another like $2 million from the police budget to fund more activities and more recreational programs for our youth? If we're always claiming that our youth have nothing to do and that because they have nothing to do, they're out there in the streets, one of the solutions then is to fund the recreation program, fund all these initiatives that will make our kids safe and give our kids something safe to do. The other thing what Walter was saying is redefining the roles of police officers, because many of our cities operate on a QE system. The cops go to the incident that has the highest rating. So what happens then if someone gets into a car accident? Do you really need an armed officer to be at a car accident for like 2 hours when there's maybe a robbery going on the other side of the city and all that officer's doing is taking down a police report? That makes no sense to me. Rather than that, let's try to recreate different roles where someone else can go to that car accident to fill out that police report when a police officer can go to more serious life-threatening incidences.
I think it's also about redefining the civil status of a police officer. So police officers now have qualified immunity, and the public can hardly hold them accountable for their actions. We have collective bargaining contracts with municipalities that shield police officers from being held accountable when they're involved in issues of use of deadly force. So they're allowed to file their official report 48 hours after the incident. There's no drug testing of police officers during an incident or even upon application to a police department. And I think we've given police officers this lofty status that immunizes them from being held accountable. So I think we have to do two things. I think we have to reimagine policing, but we also have to reimagine what a public safety officer really is in our community.
And I'll chime in here because Walter brought up collective bargaining. I think we need to scrutinize the role of police unions in our society. Police unions are not traditional labor unions that look out for benefits and salaries and things like that, and engage in collective bargaining. They are entirely political creatures that hold an obscene amount of power. And can derail efforts for reform every step of the way. When the Attorney General put out fairly minimal guidance on making sure that there's some transparency in police misconduct, revealing the names of officers who are convicted of the worst or most egregious misconduct in our state, the police union sued and stalled that directive from the highest ranking law enforcement officer in our state. And we, as the ACLU, full disclosure, we entered into that lawsuit to try to advocate for that transparency. But police unions are able to just derail reform efforts every step of the way. And in democratic New Jersey, the biggest police union in our state, for the first time, endorsed a presidential candidate, and they endorsed Donald Trump. And that is, telling of who the police union actually is seeking to represent. I don't even think that police unions adequately represent officers of color, let alone people of color.
Now, gentlemen, we're down to our last minute. I do want to ask one question in regards to the presidential race. Depending on the outcome and the results that we see, the early results we see tonight and in the next couple of days, will protests and calls to end racial injustices end, depending on who wins tonight?
I don't think so. I think we're well beyond that point of believing that a candidate from one particular party is going to automatically address these issues. I think people understand we're in this for the long haul, and we have to, dig our feet in, and that even if a Democrat is elected, we still have a lot of work to do to move this country to a better place.
Anyone else? Final comments?
Yeah, I agree. There's no one party. There's no one politician. There's no one that's going to save us, and we have to do the work ourselves. I think it's of course people are going to vote for whoever they vote for, but the work continues, and in fact, whoever comes into office at any level is accountable to the people, and we have to hold them accountable and make sure that we are watching every step that they make, every policy decision that they make, and that we are viewing it all from a racial justice lens. One of my fears is that if there's a change in our federal government, that people all of a sudden will be a little more comforted because or relaxed because we're not seeing somebody as horrible in terms of their rhetoric as Trump. And I think that's a mistake. I think what we need to do is keep our guards up because the bar is set so low now that any sort of anything that's not regressive or racist it will be seen as welcome. And I think we need to hold our officials to a higher standard and make sure that we're actually we're being anti-racist and actually looking for policies of equity rather than simply being comforted by the presence of somebody who's not explicitly racist.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights. This conversation can go on and on for hours, but we appreciate your time. And thank you once again for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Alrighty, folks. Now let's switch some gears here. Another big thing that's on the ballot in the state this year is legal weed. So our reporter, Mike Davis from Asbury Park Press, breaks it down in this video.
Let's talk about public question number 1, the legalization of marijuana. Now, everyone who lives in New Jersey knows that we're basically the center of the country. New York is over here, Philly is over here, and there's New Jersey right in the middle. So legalizing marijuana here could have kind of a domino effect on the rest of the Northeast and maybe even the rest of the country. There are a lot of reasons why the pro-legalization team wants your vote. The economic benefits could be huge. Thousands of jobs planting, picking, and selling legal weed, and plenty of other jobs that don't even touch marijuana, like lawyers, engineers, designers, even the tourism industry can benefit from marijuana legalization. But the big one is this: black people in this state are more than 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people, even though all of the studies show that just about everyone uses marijuana at the same rate. Activists say that legalizing marijuana would put an end to decades of this injustice.
We can end 32,000 unnecessary police interactions. That's 32,000 instances that something bad could happen, but also letting the cops actually focus on things that actually protect our community rather than policing our community.
Now, there's obviously another side of this, mainly public health and public safety. There is no equivalent of that little breath test that police officers use to determine if you're drunk while driving. And even though we have a pretty good idea that cannabis has medicinal on that until the federal government legalizes marijuana, so we don't really know how it affects the human body, either using it for medical purposes or just for recreation. So it comes down to this: like any drug, from alcohol to nicotine to opioids, legalizing marijuana is going to have some risks. But that risk comes with the potential of an economic boom and taking a big step towards justice and equality. The only question now is yes or no.
Our thanks to Mike Davis for that. For our next segment now, even here on Election Day 2020, as we all try to process the events of this year and determine the results of an election unlike any other we have ever had, it's never too early to take a look into the future, all the way to Election Day 2021. To make sense on how the events of today could potentially impact the next election, we welcome back our USA Today Network political reporters. We have Charlie Style, Dustin Rasiopi, and Stacey Barchanger, along with Matthew Hale, political science professor at Seton Hall University and Democratic councilman in Highland Park. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show.
Greetings.
Hey, everybody.
I hope everyone's ready to look into their crystal balls for this next segment, because that's what we're going to be doing. We'll first start with the hypothetical of a Joe Biden victory on Election Day here in 2020. How will that affect New Jersey moving forward? Stacey, let's start with you.
Well, of course, there are a lot of unknowns. We are using our crystal ball for a couple of hours out, and later in this segment, we'll talk a year out. But one of the things that we were discussing earlier is, Joe Biden is Mr. Amtrak, and so he probably has an understanding of our transit needs. Having run up and down the corridor. That New Jerseyans who rely on those systems will hopefully see some advantage should he win the presidency.
What else do we think about this? Anyone can jump in. Dustin, what are your thoughts on the potential for a Joe Biden impact on New Jersey if he is to win?
Well, obviously, Joe Biden being a Democrat, that's going to be good for New Jersey, a Democratic state led by a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor, who, by the way, has a pretty good relationship with Joe Biden by virtue of his past working for the Democratic National Committee and serving as ambassador to Germany under Barack Obama. So all those things bode pretty well for New Jersey. There's also issues with the tax code. The salt cap deduction under the Trump administration was a huge issue. Still is. Maybe if Biden wins, that could be revisited. I'm sure Murphy could bend his ear on that and a whole host of other things. But in the immediate term, Stacey highlights what is the most pressing need for New Jersey, and that's the Gateway Tunnel. And that's something that the Trump administration has kind of played loosely with the football on this one and teased, it's going to be infrastructure week and we're going to make America great again, and the region's infrastructure is going to get worked on, but that just hasn't happened. It's happened in bits and pieces here and there, but that tunnel needs to get done, and that'll be priority number one if there is a President Biden.
I would agree on the transportation. I just add to Dustin to just say that the type of Democrats that New Jersey has been electing into Congress are the type of Democrats that Joe Biden needs a lot of. He needs to make sure that the centrist Democrats, the Mikey Sherrills and the Josh Gottheimers, are highlighted, as a centrist Democrat. And I think as a result, he's going to need the New Jersey congressional delegation quite a bit within his own party. So I think that's another wrinkle to what could happen with a Biden win.
And taking a step further as well, what would a Biden presidency along with a Democratic-controlled United States Senate mean for New Jersey? Is there an extra wrinkle that's added when you factor in the potential for the Democrats to have a majority in the Senate?
Well, I think all those things that everybody mentioned would become more likely to happen. And I think you'll end discussion about ridiculous things like offshore drilling. I never really understood what the political advantage for that was. And we don't really, given our fuel supply, our own natural gas supply, we don't really need it. But so you'll hear less of that. But definitely all those agenda items, especially with the state and local tax deduction, they're going to need that Senate to be Democratic to make that happen. And that's I think that's going to be the biggest priority, because the gateway is a lot of that's already in the pipeline, and the Trump administration's just been sitting on it. You take away the Trump administration and put the Biden people in, they'll greenlight it. Whereas the SALT deduction, you're going to need a Democratic Senate.
I also think a Democratic Senate means Senator Menendez becomes chair of foreign relations, maybe banking. I mean, it's like he's up on the food chain in the Senate, and he becomes a pretty high, powerful chair right away. So that's good for New Jersey as well.
And now for the other side as well, let's talk about a potential second term for President Trump and what that would mean for New Jersey. It seemed like the president and Governor Murphy got along, at least during the coronavirus pandemic earlier in this year. What would a second term for President Trump mean for the Garden State?
A hellscape.
Well,
I'm sorry, I had to say that, but
I was going to go there too.
I might say it. Yeah.
Probably more lawsuits from the Attorney General's office here. Kabir Graywall has made a career out of suing President Trump on a whole host of issues, but it would certainly present challenges for Governor Murphy, because he's railed against Donald Trump so hard for the first 2 years, and then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden he had to become a diplomat. And as you noted, he's worked really well with the president. He's avoided any nasty tweets, which counts for quite a lot, actually. And he's actually gained a couple of concessions from the president, going back to the Gateway project, a related project on the Portal Bridge. He got some assistance there. But can he do that for another 4 years? It's really hard to navigate Trump's orbit without getting completely obliterated by him.
Well, I actually think that there's also an opportunity for Governor Murphy if Trump were to win, because if Trump wins, the Democratic Party is going to take an incredibly fast and full left-hand turn. That the next time that the Democrats are going to go with, say, enough of these centrists, enough of these, pretend Democrats. Let's go with a full-on progressive agenda as far left as we possibly can. And Phil Murphy's in that conversation. Phil Murphy could be a standard bearer for that part of, and I think probably is a standard bearer for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And so if Biden loses, the Democrats are going to, I think, shuttle being centrist and go to the left. And I think that could be an opportunity for Phil Murphy in 4 years. So.
And how would a hypothetical Trump victory on Election Day 2020, how would that impact or at least foreshadow how we believe New Jersey voters will act in 2021 in the state elections? Will we see a sort of red wave in New Jersey, or will we still see some of the Democrats kind of rebel against the second term of Trump's presidency at a state level?
I don't see that there's enough people and Republicans left in New Jersey for a red wave. It'd be more like a red trickle. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's incredible what we've seen with the Democratic registration drive, particularly in the past 4 years. I mean, you were seeing Republican strongholds like the 11th district, the 7th district, which stretches from Hunterdon County all the way up to the wealthy suburbs of Union and in Somerset, are being overrun by Democrats. It's not a question of like a slow growth. They're like carpenter ants. They're everywhere. And they are really sort of, I mean, the Somerset County Freeholder Board is now Democratic for the first time since LBJ. So I don't foresee a Republican trickling. One thing I do see about the Republican Party in this state, it seems like they're every day that passes, they seem to be imbibing more and more into of Trumpism. I mean, Doug Steinhardt, the state chairman, looks like his rhetoric just gets edgier and Trumpier by the hour. So I think they've kind of come to the realization that if we're going to be a relevant party and we're going to keep the party together, we may be a rump party, but we're going to be a Trump party. Rump, wasn't. But, that's what I think they're going to do. I think they're buying in.
But I do, just to add something, I do wonder how that will play out next year, because you have certain state level Republicans like Assemblyman John Bramnick who have sort of walked this line of do I embrace Trump? Do I distance myself from his rhetoric, which is what Assemblyman Bramnick has tried to do. And he and the other 79 members of the Assembly and 40 members of the Senate who are on the ballot next year, it's sort of a question of, will they have Trump hanging over their heads next year, or won't they? And will that change, how they run their campaigns? I don't know that they'll gain many seats, given, like Charlie said, there's 1 million more registered Democrats in New Jersey than Republicans. But at the same time, we saw the legislative District 1 flip from Democrat to Republican last year. So lots of unknowns, I guess, going into next year.
Yeah, I think that the Republicans in New Jersey they can be very narrow. I mean, Mike Testa is a Trump fan, and he's certainly making waves as being, the future of the Republican Party in New Jersey. To Charlie's point, but then you have this same tension that Bramnick is saying he's as close as you can get to being a never Trumper, I think, and maybe they just keep their head down. Because I don't think Trump, even if he wins nationally, I don't think he's ever going to be popular in New Jersey. I just think he's too antithetical to everything. Even most Republicans in New Jersey they don't believe in Trump. So, right,
I agree with that. I mean, Bramnick, Jack Ciattarelli is another one that's in this dilemma. I mean, I saw a picture of him the other day at a Chris Smith rally. And he's there with the megaphone. Chris Smith is a representative of the 4th District and the Republican who won his seat, who's probably going to be reelected. There he is with a bullhorn with Jack Ciattarelli at an event, and some guy on the left waving a Trump flag, unfurling over the shoulder of Jack Ciattarelli. To me, that's emblematic of the dilemma he's in. Jack Ciattarelli isn't a Trumpian. Jack Ciattarelli is a pragmatic businessman from Raritan, who wants to fix things and make things be more productive. That's his big MO. He's not an ideologue, but he's going to have to play with, he's going to have to nod and wink with them, and I think they're going to want more than a nod and wink.
And the results of today, Stacey mentioned it earlier, the assembly races that we have next year in New Jersey. Governor Murphy is up for re-election as well. But what could the results of today mean for 2021 statewide elections in New Jersey? And Stacey, we'll go to you on that.
I guess just, like what I was talking about is there's this calculation for assembly people and senators about, do they embrace Trump? We just don't know at this point if they will even have to make that a consideration next year. And I mean, I'm sure one of my colleagues can talk about the governor's race. As Charlie was just saying, it's just a big question of whether that will have to be a calculation for our state level candidates next year.
I think one of the most interesting things about the 2021 governor's race is the NJEA just endorsed Governor Murphy. It's like there's no one on the ballot right now. There's no one in the neighborhood of the ballot right now. We're talking about the 2020 election, and a week and a half ago, the NJEA already said we're backing the governor. We're backing Murphy, and I think that points to his popularity right now. He is, by most measures, Governor Murphy has handled the COVID crisis as well as anybody, and I think he's got a national reputation for taking care of business in New Jersey, and I think that, like I said, I think that is something that he can play on, not just in the 2020 race where he's sort of clearing out any competition, but he could translate that into nationally. I think it's interesting that you could make an argument without COVID. His poll numbers were not, magnificent. He may have left in a Biden administration, but I think he's really found his footing as a COVID governor. And I think that in 2021, he's going to be tough to beat in New Jersey, and I think he has a future afterwards too. So.
Yeah, and Murphy also, there of course will be speculation whether he'll leave for a Biden administration if Biden wins, but that may not be as enticing as making history in New Jersey. I mean,
yeah,
not since I've been born has New Jersey elected a Democratic governor for re-election. So that would really be a huge achievement for Phil Murphy, and somebody who just came out of nowhere a couple of years ago and was just a long shot candidate to go from that status to making modern history would really be a pretty incredible feat for him.
Plus, I mean, remember, he stumbled when he first was governor, right? His first year and a half was not pretty, right? And he has certainly righted that ship, and that's a big part of that story too.
Yeah, that's no question about it. I agree with you, Justin. I was just going over that. The three two-term governors that we've had in the past 40 years have been Republicans, and so which really shows you this was a maroon state until the last 4 years. It really was. It was a blend. I think, though, if he's going to do anything, his eye is he wants to be part of the national conversation for 2024, whatever that may be. Just at least put himself in a position to be talked about. Who knows if he really wants to really run? And the only way to do that is to have a successful blowout victory followed by a fairly successful second term. And that's why I think the NJEA was basically saying, look, to any buddy's thinking about running against Phil Murphy, get out of the way. We're coalescing around him, particularly Steve Sweeney. If there's any talk about Steve Sweeney, which I think is really, that was him there.
Yeah.
This puts a kibosh on it, because there was some concern because Sweeney had aligned himself with the NJEA over some pension reform deal last year, and it looked like he was currying favor with his dreaded enemy, the teachers union. So this is the union saying, no, don't worry about it. We got Phil's back.
Yep.
And we'll wrap up on this one. We'll go quickly around the panel, and we'll start with Stacey. Just some of the stories that you're following tonight that you think could really have a big impact coming in the next couple days and years. What are you really focusing on tonight for the results?
Yeah, I'm watching a couple of our ballot questions, the other two that aren't about weed, which hopefully people have also heard about. One would expand property tax benefits to veterans. Something very similar passed like a 3-1 margin last year. And then there's this third question that has to do with how New Jersey draws its election map, the districts that decide who represents people in Trenton. It has to do with census delays. A recent Rutgers Eagleton poll showed voters really weren't sure about that one. So I'm very interested to see how that goes. And that will potentially change where you vote next year or maybe in 2023. We'll wait and see.
Dustin, what are some things you're following?
Well, obviously, the number one ballot question on marijuana is a huge one. It's likely going to pass, but I'm more interested in what's going to happen after that, because that's where the huge challenge is going to be, is writing the legislation and setting the requirements for marijuana legalization, because there is a huge number of concerns about how lawmakers and Governor Murphy are going to address systemic racism and social justice issues related to that, and that there's a lot of other competing interests involved in that. So it's going to be a huge, probably long, drawn out fight. And of course, I can't help but just be completely engrossed in what's going to happen in the coming days with the results of the presidential election, and whether Donald Trump squeaks another one out to everyone's surprise, or if.
And Matthew, as well, what are you looking forward to and following along with tonight?
Well, I've been scouring the public question number one, the wording of it, just to see if there's a possibility of implementation before we start counting votes, because I think that would really help the process tonight. I think it's going to win by a big landslide, and I think that's as Dustin said. I think the devil is in the details, right? That's how fast how are we going to make that work? That's going to be a big story in New Jersey coming up. The other thing that I think is interesting is a lot of parts of New Jersey. There's a lot of sort of our counties, and we're going to know the results of our congressional races in the 7th and the 2nd and the 3rd. Those aren't unlike places in Pennsylvania, and aren't unlike places that where the presidential vote is in doubt or matters. And so I think I expect the Democrats to win the close ones, but if we can get a sense of how close it was, or how whether there was a landslide in the 2nd or a landslide in the 3rd or the 7th, maybe that'll tell us something a little bit more about how Pennsylvania is going to go, or how Ohio is going to go, because our voters aren't much different in some respects in some of those places than swing voters. So I think that's an interesting way of looking tonight. We're going to know, but what does that tell us about the rest of the country? So those are a couple things.
And Charlie, last but not least, we heard from you earlier, but any other things that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'm interested in particularly in that 2nd district race. I agree with Matt. I think these are kind of bellwethers for other swing districts around the country. The 7th district is more aligned with, say, like Bucks County, but the 2nd district is a tougher read. It's more blue collar, it's more rural, and I think that's more reflective of a more central Pennsylvania district. So if there is a Democratic victory there, it would really augur well for Biden in Pennsylvania. So I'm about to go down to that Atlantic City to see if I can get into the Democratic headquarters. No one really knows whether we'll be allowed in the Republican. So.
Well, thank you all for stopping by the show and taking a look ahead to 2021 and beyond with us tonight. Thanks for all being here.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Our thanks to our guests. Today's election, as I said, is not over, but of course, never too early to take a look ahead. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us for that last segment. The work does not end for the USA Today Network political team, so be sure to follow along for all of your 2021 election news.
Thank you, folks, for tuning in for our live coverage of the 2020 election tonight. And most of all, thanks to our reporters and our guests for joining us on this historic evening. I'm Jessie Gomez.
And I'm Ryan Ross. Thank you for watching tonight, and be sure to stay with the USA Today Network for all of your results and analysis to all the elections taking place tonight. Thank you for watching, and good night.